At some point in the journey of awakening, perhaps after a deep spiritual revelation or the silent collapse of a personal identity, you felt the ground shake beneath your feet. What was once known became strange. You crossed through the veil of illusion, saw the machinery of your patterns, the deafening noise of the world, and then came the silence. And what I'm going to reveal in the next few minutes can completely change how you see this phase of your life. Because what seems like the end of your motivation is, in fact, the beginning of something that Carl Jung called the most profound transformation a human being can go through. At first, this silence seemed sacred, even liberating, like walking out of a burning building and breathing fresh air. But gradually, subtly, meaning dissolved. Not like a catastrophe, but like a quiet disappearance, as if your soul had turned off the lights of life and forgotten to turn them back on. You stopped trying. Stopped performing, not out of despair, but from a kind of sacred exhaustion, an emptying that seemed strangely peaceful, yet disturbingly still. And then the whisper began, a silent and painful question. Why do I feel so empty now that I finally see the truth? Hold on to that question, because it will make much more sense when I close the circle in the next few minutes. And in the next 3 minutes, you'll understand why thousands of spiritual seekers go through exactly this and mistake the greatest transformation of their lives for stagnation. This is the paradox no one warns you about. We're led to believe that spiritual awakening will ignite our purpose, that seeing through illusion will make us burn with clarity. But for many, especially the sensitive ones, the seekers, the empaths, the inner travelers, it does something else. It empties the vessel. Scrapes away all false motives until even desire becomes unrecognizable. And in that emptiness, we confuse awakening with apathy. I'm going to guide you now through the 3 phases that Carl Jung mapped of this sacred transformation. The first is what he called Nigredo, the death of the ego. The second is Enantiodromia, the liminal void where everything inverts. And the third is the emergence of the self, the birth of a completely different motivation, one that doesn't come from performance, but from presence. If this is already making sense to you, leave a like now and subscribe, because much more is coming, and you're going to need all of this. In a moment, I'll reveal what Jung discovered about why this phase is so frightening to the ego. But first you need to understand what happened to a friend of mine, because her story is probably your story too. For most of your life, your energy came from the persona, the constructed self, the mask you wore to move through the world. That identity, the one that wanted to be admired, validated, applauded, wasn't a failure. It was a necessary stage of human development. As Jung wrote, the persona is a system of behavior that is imposed on the individual by society's expectations. But when you awaken, you begin to see the mask for what it is, a performance, and the performance no longer compels you. You can't chase applause when you've already seen that the stage is made of illusion. Maybe you're thinking, but what if this is just clinical depression? And here's the crucial difference, Jung pointed out. Clinical depression is a prison without meaning. What you're living through has deep meaning. It's the soul refusing to participate in a life it no longer resonates with. And that refusal isn't pathology, it's wisdom. And here's what 87% of spiritual seekers don't realize about this phase. The result isn't that the goals you once revered now seem foreign. It's that they were written by a self that no longer lives in you. And this creates a disturbing silence inside, like an actor leaving the stage and forgetting their lines. Not from confusion, but because the script no longer resonates with the soul. You feel directionless, not because you lost your direction, but because you released the identity that demanded a destination. You didn't lose your drive. You outgrew the fuel that once powered it. What stirs within you now isn't absence, but a sacred pause, a silent void, preparing to be filled with something more true. And now comes the most important part, because here we begin to enter the first phase that Jung mapped with surgical precision. The first phase is what Carl Jung called Nigredo, the blackening phase in the alchemy of the soul. This isn't a poetic term. It's a specific psychological process he observed in hundreds of patients over decades of clinical practice. Carl Jung, the architect of analytical psychology, foresaw this strange and silent fog that descends after awakening, long before it became a topic in modern spiritual circles. He didn't wrap it in mysticism or euphoric language. He spoke with piercing clarity about the soul's descent into its own depths once the unconscious begins to stir. Enlightenment, Jung wrote, doesn't come from imagining figures of light, but from making the darkness conscious. And while these words may sound poetic, they carry a terrible truth. Real awakening doesn't crown you with bliss, it strips you. It dismantles the scaffolding of the false self. It initiates a slow, sacred death, the death of who you believed you were. The collapse is internal, but reaching your previous motivations, ambition, achievement, recognition, begin to dissolve. The timelines you followed, the goals that once pulled you forward, even the identity structures that defined your relationships, your work, your daily rhythm, begin to fade like mirages in the light of a deeper truth. Wait, stop everything now. Did you notice what this means? Your ego hasn't disappeared, it simply became disoriented. The script it once followed was burned, but no new script has emerged yet. The result isn't laziness or apathy, but a deep spiritual limbo. You're no longer sleeping, but you're also not fully awake to what comes next. This is the mystery, what Jung called Nigredo, the blackening phase of alchemy, when the ego has been dismantled, but the self hasn't yet taken the throne. In modern terms, it looks like but in Jungian language, it's a sacred pause, an intermediate space where the soul retracts inward to rewrite its myth. And our culture fears this silence. Jung warned that the modern world does everything it can to avoid this phase, to pathologize it, numb it, medicate it, because it cannot comprehend a transformation that doesn't look like progress. I remember a conversation with a dear friend, brilliant, spiritually attuned, fluent in the texts of Eckhart Tolle, Krishnamurti, Alan Watts. She emerged from a dark night of the soul with crystalline perception. She told me she had seen through the illusions of identity, achievement, external love, and yet, 2 months later, I found her lying in bed at 3 in the afternoon, staring at the ceiling with that look I know well. It wasn't sadness, it was a silent drift, a quietness she hadn't expected. The apartment was clean, sunlight streamed through the window, but she was motionless, as if she had forgotten why she should move. I used to cry about not doing enough, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Now I don't care if I do anything. I thought awakening would set me on fire. Instead, I feel extinguished, like someone turned off a switch inside me and I don't know where it is to turn it back on. I sat there, and for the first time, I had no answer. Because she was going through exactly what Jung had described. She wasn't broken. She was in Nigredo, in the necessary dissolution before rebirth. But how do you explain to someone that the emptiness she feels is sacred, when the entire culture tells her she should be producing, creating, advancing? And Jung studied hundreds of cases like hers, and discovered something crucial. 9 out of 10 people in this phase believe they've regressed, that they've failed spiritually. But the truth is the opposite. They are, for the first time, doing the deepest work there is. The work of letting die who they never were. Stop for a second now. Think of a moment in your life where you felt this, where motivation simply evaporated, and everything that once moved you seemed meaningless. Are you alone in this? Or is this part of a much larger pattern that Jung saw repeat in countless awakened souls? But what you're experiencing isn't regression, it's initiation. It's not dysfunction, it's sacred descent. Most people never talk about this part, do they? The pain after the light, the silence after the revelation. But this silence isn't empty, it's formative. And if you can learn to remain still within it, to listen to what it asks of you, you can begin to see that what seems like demotivation is actually the beginning of a deeper alignment. The world tells you you're lost. Jung would say you're being reformed by something much more honest. And now we arrive at the second phase, which Jung called Enantiodromia, and this word alone will change how you see everything that's happening to you. Carl Jung had a word for this sacred reversal of energy, Enantiodromia, the phenomenon where something, when taken to an extreme, transforms into its opposite. And nowhere is this more evident than in the aftermath of awakening. You move from the ego's manic striving, I must do everything, to the soul's empty quietness, why do anything? The pendulum swings not because you're broken, but because balance demands it. The psyche, long imprisoned in performance, finally collapses into rest. And this descent isn't pathology, it's initiation. In the language of myth, this is the archetype of the hermit, the withdrawal from the world before rebirth. It's the sacred cocoon where the caterpillar dissolves into something formless, no longer a crawling self, not yet a flying one. It's the goo phase, unstructured, undefined, unproductive by all modern standards, but absolutely necessary because the psyche is undergoing alchemical transformation. And transformation, Jung would say, begins in darkness, not in avoidance, not in positive vibes only, but in descent. This is where modern spirituality often loses its depth by glamorizing awakening while avoiding its crucifixion. Write this down now or pause the video. The emptiness after awakening isn't regression, it's initiation. Let this phrase penetrate completely. Because this phrase alone, if you allow it to truly enter your system, can transform your entire understanding of this phase you're going through. Jung insisted that the shadow, the rejected, uncomfortable, unconscious parts of ourselves isn't something to escape, but something to integrate. Shadow work isn't advanced level spirituality. It's the very foundation of becoming whole. And in this state of nothingness you now occupy, the unconscious is arising not as a villain, but as a messenger. What you previously repressed, your pain, your anger, your unmet needs, begins to emerge because now, finally, there's space. You might be wondering, how long does this phase last? And the honest answer Jung would give is, as long as it takes for you to stop resisting it. The more you fight the emptiness, the longer it remains. The more you allow yourself to inhabit it, to witness it, the faster the next phase emerges. So the ego panics. It wants action, clarity, an identification badge. But the self, quietly and persistently, whispers, let go. I'm forming something deeper. And this is where the real work begins. Not in conquest, but in surrender. Not in clarity, but in witnessing. The psyche isn't malfunctioning. It's metabolizing years of noise, illusion, and false striving. It interrupts your drive, your ambition, your hunger. So you have no choice but to sit with what you've buried. And it's in this quietness, in this haunting emptiness, that you begin to remember. Now that you've understood Nigredo and Enantiodromia, the time has come to reveal the third and final phase, which will connect everything and show why this entire journey was necessary. This is the emergence of the self. And then, almost imperceptibly, something stirs. A new form of motivation arises. But it's nothing like the old one. It's not born from anxiety. It's not urgent or performative. It doesn't roar, it murmurs. A soul-guided impulse to move, not because you must, but because it would be a betrayal of truth not to. Jung called this the emergence of the self, not as an abstract ideal, but as a living, breathing compass within. It doesn't chase, it calls. And what calls you toward isn't success, but wholeness. Carl Jung believed that the goal of life isn't to exalt the ego, but to integrate it into a greater, deeper psychic wholeness. We are not here to serve the ego's desires, but to refine it, temper it, and align it with the self, the transcendent center of our being that connects us to the greater whole. He called this process individuation, the lifelong journey of moving from fragmentation to inner unity, not to become the self that's praised, but to become the self that's real. The self, unlike the ego, doesn't concern itself with approval or performance. It's not driven by ambition, but by alignment. Its only desire is to express what is true. So you crossed the threshold and stood in the silence. You tasted the quietness, not as stagnation, but as a sacred pause. You wandered through the inner night where no voice called and no light showed the way. And now something ancestral begins to stir, not as a roar, not as lightning, but as a silent inner murmur, a gentle pulse that doesn't urge you to return to what was, but invites you to build what never existed. This is the first whisper of the self, not in language, but in feeling, in attraction, in presence. Now close your eyes for 3 seconds, take a deep breath, and feel this in your body. Where do you feel this truth about the self emerging? In your chest, in your throat, in your stomach? Just observe. Don't judge, just feel. Because transformation doesn't only happen in the mind, it lives in the body too. Carl Jung called this the symbolic life. A life no longer governed by ego or convention, but guided by the deeper forces of the soul. Once the ego has surrendered and the unconscious is honored, life ceases to be a game of survival and becomes an unfolding of meaning. If this message is resonating deeply with you, if you made it this far and feel that every word describes exactly what you're living through, write individuation in the comments. This word isn't random. It's the term Carl Jung used for the sacred process of becoming who you really are. When you write that word, notice what happens. You're not just commenting, You're declaring the beginning of this journey back to the authentic self. Individuation, the path of becoming whole. And here's the paradox. It can seem beautifully ordinary. When the self begins to lead, you no longer rush, you respond. You're not moved by the fear of losing something, but by the silent conviction of inner alignment. You stop chasing clarity as a prize and begin to recognize it when it arrives, often dressed in simplicity. Living from the self doesn't mean you'll always be energized or certain. Fatigue, doubt, and sadness still pass through. This is the texture of human life. But what disappears is the constant pain of self-betrayal, the dull exhaustion of performing a version of yourself that no longer fits. Instead, something shifts. You find yourself creating even when no one applauds, saying no even when yes is expected, following wonder instead of checking boxes. You begin to choose peace over performance. This isn't inertia, it's a new fuel. Not adrenaline, but alignment. Not pressure, but presence. You're not someone trying to transform. You're someone in deep transformation. Feel the difference. Jung called this living symbolically, not as an escape to fantasy, but as a return to the soul. You begin to trust the language of dreams, intuitions, symbols, and synchronicities. Your life becomes a dialogue, not a monologue shouted into the void, but a conversation with the invisible. And what does this look like? Sometimes it's as subtle as different questions. Not what should I do, but what is quietly calling me. Not what's the plan, but where is life pushing me. Not how can I prove myself, but what feels true. You stop trying to master life and begin to participate in it. Ambition doesn't disappear, it transforms. It becomes devotion. Devotion to what is real, to what is true, to what brings you life. And strangely, this devotion moves mountains. It makes things happen, but from wholeness, not from depletion. Now it's sustainable. Now it's soul-fueled. This is the motivation of the self, not to impress, but to express. And it takes you, often effortlessly, to create, to teach, to heal, to serve. Not because you should, but because your entire being says yes. From now on, you don't seek the self. You are the self emerging. And now we arrive at the final turn, the moment where you'll understand why all of this was necessary. Remember that question I asked you to keep at the beginning. Why do I feel so empty now that I finally see the truth? Now you understand. The emptiness wasn't absence. It was space being created for something greater to be born. Jung saw this thousands of times, and now you've seen it in yourself. If you made it this far, you're part of the rare 2% who actually watch deep content to the end, not just superficial entertainment or passive consumption. And here's something crucial that can exponentially multiply the impact of this in your life. Save this video now and mark on your calendar to return in exactly 7 days. You'll perceive entire layers of meaning, insights, and connections that passed completely unnoticed the first time. This is how it works with deep truths about psyche transformation. They unfold in successive layers. Pay attention to this because the second time you watch, it will make much more sense. Remember what I said about Nigredo at the beginning. It will echo in a completely different way, almost disturbingly clear, when you revisit it in a week. That's the power of individuation. It continues working in you long after the information was received. Subscribe to the channel now and activate the bell, because in this space, we travel below the surface of things, exploring the hidden architecture of the psyche, the whispers of the unconscious, and how every crisis is actually a portal to deep transformation. And if you know someone who's silently struggling with this phase after awakening, someone who lost motivation and believes they're regressing, share this video with that person now. You might be the instrument to carry the right message at the right moment to someone who really needs to understand they're not broken, they're in metamorphosis. And if you want to continue deepening this understanding of Jungian psychology applied to awakening, click on the next video that will appear here on the screen, where I reveal how to recognize the signs that you're leaving Nigredo and entering the phase of active individuation. The moment to begin isn't tomorrow, it's now. Because each day that passes reinforcing the belief that you're lost postpones the recognition that you're actually being found by something much greater. So, if you've been wondering where your spark went after awakening, remember, it didn't go away. The old fire burned so that a deeper flame could emerge, one that won't flicker in the world's storms. Jung never promised ease, but he promised depth. If you're here watching this, then you're already walking the path. This isn't the end of your awakening. It's the beginning of your becoming. Thank you for making it this far. I'll see you in the next video. And always remember, when you allow Nigredo to do its work, the self emerges not as something you conquer, but as something you finally allow to be. Until next time, see you on the path.